Today we'll be sharing the results and products from the GEMS project, which was funded by the National Academy's Gulf Research Program. The project is a collaboration between the Hart Research Institute at Texas A&M, the Nicholas Institute at Duke University, the Nature Conservancy, and the Bridge Collaborative. I'm Lydia Olander from Duke University. The other leads for the GEMS project are David Yaskowitz at the Hart Research Institute, Chris Shepard at the Nature Conservancy, and Heather Tallis from the Bridge Collaborative. You'll hear from Heather later today, and you'll meet some of our other team members in the breakout group discussions. The motivation for this work started with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico just over 11 years ago. A series of National Academies of Science reports in the years after the spill emphasized the need for measuring the social and economic impacts of both the disaster itself and the restoration efforts designed to mitigate its effect. While billions of dollars have been and are still being spent on Gulf Coast restoration, there is still no shared platform for assessing and reporting on restoration progress and effectiveness for the social and economic goals shared by many of the institutions working in the region. We hope to lay the groundwork for such a shared platform for restoration program managers and funders in the Gulf. For example, at the bottom of this slide are goals for the Restore Council, and you'll note that two of those goals, community resilience and economic revitalization, both require an understanding of the social and economic impacts of restoration. Over the past 3 years, we've created conceptual models to identify the likely social and economic outcomes of different types of restoration projects that are taking place across the Gulf of Mexico. For each of these outcomes, we brainstormed an initial set of social and economic metrics, and then refined those metrics with input from experts and practitioners. Finally, we developed measurement protocols with details about methods and resources for measuring the socioeconomic metrics. Throughout this process, we incorporated feedback from experts, practitioners, and funders every step along the way. We applied the GEMS process to a variety of different restoration approaches used across the Gulf, including 7 different types of habitat restoration, plus a deep dive into different techniques for oyster reef restoration, recreational enhancement through installing or updating recreational infrastructure, and improving water quality by applying green and gray techniques to stormwater and wastewater management. We developed ecosystem service logic models for all of the major restoration approaches used across the Gulf. The models include all the relevant social and economic outcomes. We then looked across all of these outcomes and summarized the social and economic metrics that identify strongly linked to the restoration approaches. And these are all put together into a database. There are 44 metrics, which is a lot, and not all apply to all restoration approaches. So we organized the metrics to help answer some specific questions we think funders and others might be interested in. For example, you may want to know which impacts are the same across projects that can be reported and rolled up so information can be collected across many different projects. Or you may want to know which impacts can't be observed at a project scale, so need to be so a different approach for measurement would need to be used. So we differentiate between metrics that are appropriate to measure at the project scale and those that can only be observed or modeled at the program or Gulf-wide scale. So where there's kind of the cumulative effect of multiple projects at that Gulf-wide scale. You might also want to know which metrics can be easily measured now versus those that might take a bit more investment or time, or those that don't have methods that are yet well established. So we identified different tiers of metrics. Tier 1 metrics are relatively low effort and easy to measure, while Tier 2 metrics would require additional effort and expertise for data collection and/or analysis. The research and development metrics are not fully established or require data that's not yet readily available. To provide a short list of metrics for consistency, comparison, and rolling up results, we identified a set of core metrics for each project category. These are common across project types, within, or sometimes across categories. And core metrics can be useful for comparing projects and rolling up results across these projects. And the categories here are the ones I mentioned previously. They're habitat restoration, oyster reef restoration, recreational enhancement projects, and water quality improvement projects. Measurement protocols have also been developed for each project scale metric that is either a Tier 1 or a Tier 2. These describe methods for quantifying how much each metric is changed by a restoration project, and importantly, who has access to the measured outcomes. This can help answer questions about distribution and equity of the outcomes. A few example protocols are now posted on the website, and more will be coming soon. All of these resources can be found on our GEMS website: the logic models, the metrics database, and the initial metric protocols. In the next week or two, there will also be a funder's guide that summarizes all of this information, providing a useful starting place for navigating the GEMS web resources. Now I'm going to turn this over to Heather Tellis, who will take you through an example.
Thank you, Lydia. I'm going to walk through several examples now that you might consider using GEMS resources for if you are a funder. In the first example, imagine that you are a funder that invests in one type of restoration projects in the Gulf, and you're interested in which social and economic outcomes you could expect from that type of restoration project. If this is the situation you have, then please check out the planning video that's available on the GEMS website. We've gone through this type of example in the planning video. Now imagine that you have grantees that you've asked to start thinking about social and economic outcomes, and they need some help. They need help making socioeconomic monitoring plans, and they need help finding protocols that they can use to actually start monitoring these newer kinds of outcomes. If that is your situation, then we direct you to the monitoring video that's also available on the GEMS website, where we've gone through examples that address those kinds of questions. And now for the examples that I'm going to walk through today. In this first example, imagine that you are a funder that wants to fund efforts that create specific types of social and economic changes. And you are wondering which restoration project types can be funded to create those kinds of changes. So for this kind of a question, you could navigate to the GEMS website. This is the main landing page, and scroll down to search models and metrics. You can enter into the site here, and it'll give you two options for how to look more closely at the data. You can search by project type or search the full metrics list. For this question, we're going to use the full metric list. On this page, you can first see all of the different types of outcomes that were explored through the GEMS project. You can see that restoration projects in the Gulf have been connected to cultural values, several different outcomes related to economic activity, like agricultural, economic activity, fin, fish, and shellfish harvest, local business, etc. Several outcomes associated with human health, including drowning or food security and mosquito-borne illness and others. Several outcomes associated with property protection and values, the social cost of carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, social disruption, and several outcomes associated with water system costs. So in this case, let's say you're interested in funding projects that cause property protection from erosion. You want to protect shorelines. You want to do that by investing in projects at the project scale. So you select that here for scale and apply those filters, and then we can scroll down and see the results. So this is the metric that has come up through this search for property protection from erosion. What this result shows you, what we want to look at, is over here on the right. And this tells you which kinds of projects that metric is a core metric for. Lydia quickly introduced core metrics, and I'm going to revisit that here so you understand this key. Core metrics in our work are those that are strongly linked to a restoration approach. So for core metrics here, for habitat restoration, when over half of the restoration project types that are included in habitat restoration are strongly linked to a metric, it's considered a core metric with this solid color. If at least one project type is linked to that metric, but less than half are, then we consider it not core, but it still has some connection. And when there are no project types in that category that are linked to the metric, you'll see no color. So for our example here, again, if our question is what types of projects to invest in if we want to have a good chance of causing property protection from erosion, this would tell us that habitat restoration, HR, has that as a core metric for more than half of its project types. So that's a pretty safe bet. That would in fact be our best bet because it's the only category of restoration projects in the Gulf that has that strong association with this outcome. This tells us that there are some types of oyster restoration and recreation enhancement projects that are likely to cause this outcome to change, but fewer of those project types are associated with this outcome. And in fact, it would not be a good bet to invest in water quality improvement because none of those project types have this as a core metric. So that's one example of how you might use the GEMS resources. In a second example, let's imagine that we are a funder that's investing in all of the major types of restoration in the Gulf, and we already require ecological monitoring by the projects that we invest in. But now we want to start tracking the most relevant social and economic outcomes that our restoration investments might cause as well. And you want to know where to start. So we can go back to the GEMS website, enter as we did before into searching models and metrics. To answer this question, we want to again see the full metric list. And in this case, we're going to focus only on core metrics. Because again here, we want to find those metrics that are common or consistent across all of the restoration project types that we invest in. On this core metric table, it's similar to the one that we just looked at, but a little bit different. And that in addition to the colors we see here that show us which are the core metrics, just as before, we also have the number of restoration project types within a category that have a metric as a core metric. So what we can see here is if we are investing in all of the restoration project types across the Gulf, these first 5 metrics are core for more than half of all project types. That means they're a pretty sure bet as a starting point for the kinds of things that could be measured and would be likely to respond to more than half of all the project types invested in the Gulf. This is pretty encouraging to me and an exciting finding of this work because it shows that there are some metrics of social and economic change that are likely to be relevant to all restoration project types in the Gulf. So what are these metrics? The first 2 are not going to be surprising at all. They're economic activity metrics associated with the restoration activities themselves. So the first one is restoration jobs, so literally the number of jobs created by the restoration project itself. And the second one is restoration expenditures. Again, not surprising, the amount of money invested in the project directly. So these are just direct activities of the project, but they are social and economic outcomes that can be tracked and reported. The next core metric is also an economic activity metric, but this time associated with recreational activities that the restoration projects likely support. And this would track the change in recreational activity expenditures, so economic flows, invested in the region through recreational activities supported by the project. And then the final 2 core metrics that apply to all restoration project types are human health metrics. The first one is change in cognitive function. This relates to things like simple recall or memory that's likely affected by time and nature. And the second is change in subjective well-being, or how people report feeling, how they say they're feeling at a given time. And both of these are related to people's experience and response to having time in nature at restoration projects. So again, these 5 metrics would be ones that would serve as a reasonable starting point that are likely to be influenced by the majority of restoration project types funded in the Gulf. If you wanted to go further, or if you invest in only a subset of project types, you can continue to scroll down this table and see additional metrics that are core to certain project types. So if, for example, you didn't invest in water quality improvement projects, but you did invest in habitat restoration, oyster restoration, and recreational enhancements, these additional metrics are core for all of those restoration types. And those relate to things like cultural values, other kinds of economic activity related to recreation and tourism, and another human health metric associated with food security. So this gives you an example of how you can use the findings to find a relevant set of starting points if you'd like to add social and economic metrics to existing ecological monitoring. In our final example, we want to imagine that we fund oyster restoration and recreational enhancements in the Gulf. And we already have a good plan for monitoring social and economic impacts at the project scale. But we have a sense that we are missing some Gulf-wide impacts. So what relevant changes related to social and economic conditions can only be tracked at the program scale? Are there things that we're missing at the program scale that we could be tracking? For this example, we again enter the GEMS website through searching models and metrics, explore the full metrics list, and again focus on core metrics. This time we scroll further down to program scale metrics. These give us the metrics that are only likely to be responsive or measurable beyond a project scale, either at a larger sub-regional scale in the Gulf or at a whole Gulf-wide scale. And as I said, we are a funder in this example focused on oyster restoration and recreational enhancements. So we're really interested in the core metrics that fall under these two columns. So we can see that there are 4 that we could be thinking about. The first one is an economic activity metric that is the change in economic activity from restoration spending. This is different than the metric we saw in the last example at the project scale. This is not how much money is spent on the project, but this is that sense of how much additional economic activity is leveraged by that investment. So if, as a funder, for example, you'd like to make a statement at the end of 2 years of a project that your $3 million investment leveraged $15 million of additional economic activity, this is the metric that you would be reporting. And this is not something that can be observed at the project scale. It requires modeling at a larger scale, and that's why it's a program scale metric here. You can see the additional metrics that would be relevant here related to cultural values and economic activity from recreational fishing. Again, this is a imputed value from modeling that looks at larger economic activity responding to the restoration investments. So this gives some examples of the kinds of metrics you're not likely to be able to capture effectively at the project scale, but might still be part of the impact that your investments are having that you'd like to be able to report on. So those are a few examples of how you can use the GEMS resources from the perspective of questions that might be relevant to funders. Now I'll turn it back to Lydia to move us into a conversation.
Hello, everyone. So thank you, Heather, for taking us through those examples. I'm hoping we could put the website link into the chat, Rachel, so that folks can access that if they want to look around themselves while we go to the breakouts. So hopefully we'll have time to answer all your questions now. We're going to talk to you all about the GEMS project and the tools and discuss how these might be useful for your work. We're going to break into some smaller groups to make it easier to have a conversation. And each group will have at least one of the GEMS team's members in that group to facilitate and answer questions. So, all right, everyone, welcome back from the breakouts. So I'm hoping that our team could pop our emails into the chat on the side. My email is here on this slide. We just want to make ourselves available in case you have any questions or want to follow up on anything you saw or talked about today. I want to thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. The last 2 webinars we did on monitoring and planning, the recordings will be available and online shortly, and we'll also have the recording for this webinar available. So if you have people within your group or community that you want to share them with, that would be great. You can send them to the webinar recording. There's also an upcoming general webinar at the end of May that we're going to touch on all 3 of these topics at a higher level. So please feel free to share that with others in your network who might be interested as well. And we'd really like to hear your feedback about these resources and your ideas for potentially working together in the future. We're going to have a very short survey, and the link will be in the chat if it's not already. So we'd appreciate it if you could it's a very quick, short survey, if you would provide your thoughts in that document. All right, well, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and we hope to hear from you soon.